Welcome to another CMC podcast. Today we're going to be discussing NASAR, the National Association for Search and Rescue. And joining us today, we have the Executive Director of NASAR, Chris Boyer. Chris, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Doug. Thank you very much to you and CMC for having me here. I was in the Marine Corps for about 10 years, serving my country at a high level. And when I got out, I wanted to serve it at a more local level. And I ended up joining a local search and rescue team in a California county and becoming a reserve deputy for them. And when I retired there, I got picked up by a private company that did aircraft crash recovery. Did that for 5 years and traveled the world doing it. And when that got old, NASAR picked me up. And I've been here this will be my 8th year as their executive director.
Oh, congratulations. Definitely a very eclectic background leading into it, so it's got to serve you well.
Yeah, some of the technology that I dealt with helps, certainly, and also the understanding the political background and variations of that. It's done me a lot of good here in NASAR, understanding that.
Oh, very good. And then also joining us today, we have John McKently, also a former NASAR board member and former treasurer of NASAR. John, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, as you said, my relationship with NASAR, I was a member of the board before Chris's time and the treasurer. The organization's changed a little bit since then, but Chris has carried on, and it really surprised me when he said 8 years. It's like I remember all that going on and didn't realize it has been that long, but time flies when you're having fun. My background and how I got into it is similar to Chris's in as much as I was until just a couple of months ago, a volunteer search and rescue person for Los Angeles County Sheriff. I too, as was the norm in those days for Los Angeles County, we were all reserve deputies. And I did 47 plus years and a couple thousand search and rescue missions for them, and just recently retired, but still staying active with search and rescue in teaching and other aspects. And of course, for some of you that are listening that didn't know, I was the school director for CMC Rescue for 25 years, and I'm still teaching classes, but I did retire as the school director. So happy to be here.
Excellent.
Yeah, and John and I met back in 1999, I think, John.
There you go. It's been at least 20 years. I know that.
It's been at least 20 years. And I think that it was actually in Barstow at SAR City in 1999. And you and Matt Sharper, the California State SAR coordinator, were at the Ramada Inn walking out of the lobby. And I was walking in. And I introduced myself to Matt and said, hey, I'm kind of new here, but I'd really like to help the state out with teaching, and I know PowerPoint. And that started a really long relationship that damaged all of us.
Well, I don't know about damage, but yeah, I believe you on the year, and I definitely know PowerPoint. So
yeah, it's been a lot of years.
Yep.
Excellent. So why don't we kind of start the discussion here? Kind of give us a status quo. What is search look like in the U.S. today?
John and I both came out of California, which is an interesting state. Very legislated when it comes to search and rescue. Very formal. And that's not the status quo across the U.S., as I have learned over the past 8 years. And I'd like to explain it to the audience by comparing California and Texas, two of the largest states here in the continental United States. And in California, you've got a couple of pieces of California government code that essentially give search and rescue to the 58 county sheriffs. And each of those county sheriffs has a uniformed volunteer cadre that does search and rescue. Some of them are reserve officers, some of them are not. They're typically just search and rescue outdoors folks. And the sheriff, in most cases, helps fund them, provides them with uniforms, provides them with training, and takes care of the feeding of that team while they're there. And in a post 9/11 world, a lot of those teams expanded into force multipliers. I know in the Bay Area that the team there post 9/11 got a lot of money, and they started manning the command post for the sheriff's department and bringing out the porta potties and doing other things, other missions other than SAR, because they were available and they were good volunteers and very responsible. In Texas, or I'm sorry, in California, if you want mutual aid, if you run out of resources, you can ask the state to provide you with mutual aid from another county. And the sheriffs all agree to do that for free to each other, to be friendly and to support each other at a county government level. Now you go to Texas, and in Texas, none of that exists. There's no legislation that gives search and rescue to anyone. So there are literally hundreds of search and rescue teams. Some of them wear t-shirts and shorts. Some wear snake boots and gaiters. But none of them is really sponsored by a law enforcement agency or has a direct relationship to a law enforcement agency where that agency owns that group and pays for its training or covers it for insurance or anything. The teams overlap, they compete, they are not friendly, and it's a difficult situation. And the rest of the United States falls in between those two examples. California has formal mutual aid, which it supports the citizens. Texas does not. Either does Alabama or other states. New Mexico, it's the state police, the troopers that own search and rescue. So it really search and rescue suffers from a lack of standardization across all the states. And so that's one of the things that NASAR, through its advocacy program, tries to resolve, is to give every citizen the same standard of care and the same level of care, because a citizen in Texas deserves the same response that a citizen or resident of California would.
Yeah, it kind of definitely sounds like you've got your work cut out for you there, trying to bring everything under at least a somewhat uniform umbrella.
Yeah, it's not a short job. It's the long haul.
Yeah. So how long has NASAR been in existence and kind of working on this issue then?
Well, NASAR started when I was 9 years old, 1969. Hal Foss was the state of Washington search and rescue director, the very first one in the United States at that time, working for their civil defense program. And back in 1969, he felt like something needed to be done about these same issues: standardization, training for volunteers, mutual aid agreements, things like that. And at that time, Hal started talking to some of the other folks that were de facto search and rescue coordinators in the Western United States, if they weren't exactly named that by their agency. And in 1970, they held a meeting in Salt Lake City. And these 20 plus representatives got together and banged out a straw man paper and a rough organizational structure that they thought would work moving forward. And they wanted to be able to talk about search and rescue at a federal level. They wanted to talk about it at a state level and at a local level. And so they had representations from all those levels of government there. By 1974, they had become a true organization. They'd incorporated in Salt Lake City by then. They met in Boise, Idaho, and Hal Foss was the first chairman of NASAR at that time. And then some of the other folks I certainly want to mention that were part of that beginning and that founding was Tom Pryor, who was the director of civil defense in the state of Washington. He was Hal Foss's boss. and was able to let Hal do this sort of thing. Blair Nilsson was working with Colorado Civil Defense. Russ Bateman was out of Utah and their civil defense group. Jim Gibson and Troy Rhodes were both from Arizona, representing them. And Dan Vieira was out of Oregon. And Dan has a long history with the Explorer Search and Rescue youth groups. And then finally, Lou Gurley was there, and Lou represented the Nevada Highway folks, the state troopers at that time. And that was the founding group that put it all together and put us on the map.
When did it kind of start heading east, expanding eastward then?
So we started to expand eastward in the mid 80s, and we started to grow. And again, the kind of the issue here is that the western states, because they're much larger and they have a lot more county unincorporated lands, and so they would typically have a larger wilderness search and rescue problem, right? They were much more formalized, and so obviously they work together. And also, I think the Western State Sheriff's Association is a lot tighter organization than the National Sheriff's Association is. And we started to move east to the Appalachians, so there's some wilderness in the East Coast, obviously, but you also have the high-density cities now, New York, Philadelphia, that whole eastern capital corridor, and that's where you have those missing Alzheimer's and walkaways and suicides and things like that. So I think each coast has their own kind of issue with search and rescue. And that helps color their response and their training. And we see a lot more SAR Tech 3s, non-wilderness searchers, on the East Coast, and a lot more SAR Tech 2 wilderness and SAR Tech 1 non-wilderness backcountry searchers west of the Mississippi.
And that makes sense with the ground they're covering. So
well, and then one of the things that Chris alluded to is not only the size of the counties and the amount of wildlands and all those, and some of that may even come into the amount of land that's federal land, is that the role of the sheriff or various law enforcement agencies differs around the country. So in the case of, like you mentioned, California, because we're both from there, the 58 county sheriffs are charged with the responsibility for search and rescue. And they do that, and that's not uncommon in the West Coast, but as you move further east, a sheriff might simply be a process server or might have court and custody related issues rather than law enforcement or search and rescue or things like that. So kind of who's in charge varies so much around the country. There's a lot of counties in the U.S., and it's a big country and a lot of different terrain. So obviously whatever you do has to have that flexibility, but that's kind of one reason why it started that way and moved, just because of the need as well as because of what's defined in the law.
Right. Thanks, John, for that as well. Yeah.
And I have to ask, since I'm a retired fire guy, are there any states that put the search and rescue in the hands of fire?
So
from a legislation standpoint?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there are actually. State of Florida, State Fire Marshal owns it. And I'm sure, John, are there other states that you know of?
I don't know if it's by law like it is in Florida, but it's certainly the norm in a lot of the middle Atlantic states for that to be the case. Virginia, Maryland has state troopers that does wilderness search and rescue. Pennsylvania, it's kind of, I know fire guys that do it, but I don't know how well it's defined. But Virginia and West Virginia, I think it's pretty much always a fire function. I could be wrong there. In New England, where there's certainly more wildland area too, I know that just from reading news articles for all these many, many years, that it's usually the fire people that are usually talking about getting out there and ground pounding, as it were, and things like that. Again, I don't know if it's defined by statute, but it seems to be the de facto way it works.
Yeah. I know that Maine is the Fish and Game Wardens. And all those colony states there along the Capital Corridor are all Commonwealth states, so their laws are a little bit different than everybody else's too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you had talked quite a bit about California at the beginning, and one of the things I know very little about the topic, but one of the things I know I did read was how California delineates out what agency is the lead agency in different types of, whether it be search, missing persons, technical rescue, and so on. And I'll say this: California, it's very well defined who the lead agency is in all of those, and that would seem like it would solve a lot of problems everywhere if that same type of forethought was put into the planning.
To be honest, it sounds a little better sometimes on paper than it really is in the field.
Yeah,
Chris is laughing and we're all smiling, and that's pretty PC. But it's defined, but not everybody knows the rules.
Yeah, we've got a recording of the Los Angeles Fire Department helicopter system that'll let you know how well it works together.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's the difference in political entities and structure is so different in the U.S. Like you mentioned, California, very structured. There is an agency that owns everything, right? And in California, if you're doing pre-hospital medical care, you have to have an agreement with the EMS authority at the county level. So that's 58 counties you have to negotiate, right? And so every sheriff that does CPR and search and rescue, they have to negotiate with their local EMS authority to do that. Well, go to New Jersey, and the EMS authority is at the city level. So if you're doing search and rescue there, you have over 300 municipal health officers that you have to deal with. So it's not just search and rescue, it's not just fire, but it's also that pre-hospital care system and where that patient, that victim eventually goes to. And also, in some cases, the coroner and medical examiner structure that you have. So California, the sheriff is typically the coroner or medical examiner. Typically, there are a few cases like Los Angeles where that's not necessarily true. But if you go to Arkansas, the coroner is elected, and it's a part-time election position. So the guy that runs the local tire store could be your coroner, know nothing about it. In his first 2 years, he has to have a 40-hour course in coroner ethics and death scene investigation. And they have a central crime lab that if that local coroner guy can't figure out, or gal can't figure out what the cause of death was, then they refer it to the state lab and they ship the body to Little Rock and have it processed. But that's, you look at that and you go, wow. And you guys know that probably 80% of the fire departments out there are still volunteer in the United States. It's just the real municipal urban fire departments that have full-time firefighters at this point and are ISO rated probably.
Well, and then if I could maybe throw another wrench in the works here, where there's kind of a crossover, if you will, at least in some people's minds, and maybe if you could clarify it for us, Chris, what's the difference between SAR and USSAR?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question. So search and rescue, what we typically think of search and rescue is wilderness. So we have a person that's missing, and we know who that person is. And we just don't know where they are. So the reason why that kind of defaults to law enforcement is because the law enforcement investigation is so important. When you know who you're looking for, you're able to, as law enforcement, through investigation, get into those systems like the banking system, the cell phone system, et cetera, to track that person, all those sentinel systems. And so that makes sense, right? Because law enforcement can get into those sensitive areas and help find that person. On the flip side, urban search and rescue is typically a disaster, and we know where the disaster is, but we don't know who we're looking for in the disaster pile. And so it's kind of the exact opposite problem of wilderness search and rescue. And so the reason that comes over to the fire department as default is because we don't know who we're looking for. So we don't necessarily need the cops to be, doing cell phone stuff. What we need are heavy rescue technicians, the fire guys with the big red trucks. They have the right equipment. and the right background in hazmat materials and explosive atmospheres and dangerous atmospheres and shoring and cribbing and all that sort of thing, that's a totally different skill set, totally different equipment set. And so that's why wilderness SAR and urban search and rescue are such different things. Doesn't mean you don't go looking for a person that you know, but you don't know where they're at in an urban environment. But that's still basically wilderness SAR, and the buildings are just, a part of the background.
And I might add in there just to confuse things in some cases and not in others is, of course, those volunteer firefighters that Chris spoke of might also be volunteer search and rescue personnel, depending on the location, or the volunteer search and rescue people may be career firefighters. And so they kind of get in there. And then the other thing is we've been doing more on the West Coast because of that situation like Chris talked about, where we've got these funny things called earthquakes, is when you have a major disaster like that, and there's no reason why it has to be an earthquake, it could certainly apply to the storm-related flooding events that we've seen in the Gulf and East Coast recently, where everybody can get out there and starts to help. The advantage of the search and rescue teams is that they have an organized structure, they probably have a background check, they have some sort of medical ability or whatever, and it's going to vary around the country and through each organization. But when those big, widespread bad things happen, and we're not talking about a single building collapse, but we're talking about a dozen or whatever building collapses, and now the whole system is overwhelmed, and the traditional wilderness search and rescue people may be involved in the lighter side of urban search and rescue. The urban search and rescue, you've got, basically 4 levels of it, and they might be involved in the kind that only involve hand tools and not heavy hydraulics and cranes and things like that. But there's been a movement, especially on the West Coast and especially probably in California, not just because we're most familiar with it, to try and get more activity and better training for the wilderness search and rescue folks for when that disaster does happen. Eventually, there's going to be a huge mutual aid effort and may involve FEMA and FEMA teams from throughout the country, but they're not available for 24, 48, whatever number of hours. And so everybody's going to get into it if one of those things really happens, when we have what we refer to as the big one.
Yeah, John, I think of 2 really good examples that you brought up. One is Marin County Search and Rescue there in California in the Bay Area.
Very much on the forefront of that, yes.
Yeah, exactly. They go up to Yosemite every year. They do very high speed, low drag wilderness search and rescue. Some of the most experienced folks in California doing that. And at the same time, they maintain a level 3, a hand tool, urban search and rescue team, so that when they show up, they can either be the local first responder to that disaster, or they can be the force multiplier for a type 1 team to help them out. On the flip side, the other example is Texas Task Force 2. So Texas Task Force 1 is an urban search and rescue team, classical as we know it. But Texas Task Force 2 is made up of a lot of wilderness searchers with swiftwater capability, because flooding is the major problem here in Texas. And so those wilderness searchers in Texas Task Force 2 are used to doing wilderness searching, but they also will come out and help Task Force 1 during swiftwater flooding with boats and swiftwater technicians.
Yeah, so it's a crossover. Myself, we were involved with several of the earthquakes, that we've had in Southern California, where, again, we're organized. We have a call-out structure. In our case, hey, we had guns too. If it came down to that, it was never an issue. But we were organized. We had communications, and we were often used in that. Again, we weren't cutting apart parking garages, but light frame construction and things like that. It's a great place for additional training for search and rescue teams, wilderness search and rescue teams, for when they happen. And people think, oh, urban, and I live in a little tiny town. Well, it doesn't matter, something happens. It's a big wind event, it's a storm event, or whatever. The roads in there may not be accessible. It may take a long time for outside resources, and there's a lot of things that wilderness teams can and do. But it's kind of back to Doug's question about urban versus wilderness. And because we came from a wilderness background, we kind of say search and rescue, whereas search and rescue to a pure fire department is the building's on fire and we have to search the building to see if there's anybody in there that we need to evacuate. And it's a totally different thing than what you as a firefighter were used to, Doug.
Right. Well, and I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because I know another misnomer out there too are some of the terminology of like large area search versus wide area search.
Yeah, so now we move into what are called mass rescue operations. So now we're talking about Katrina or some other large event where you have a huge disaster area, and you're doing what's called a wide area search at that point, which is well past the point of saving lives. Now what we're doing is we're working on a recovery effort in this area, and you're trying to make sure that all the remains of anyone that's been missing have been found and documented and processed into the identification system with that local coroner or medical examiner. And that's a different skill set altogether too. And there are different classes. The TEACS wide area search class is the primary class where you learn about how to do that. And then we also didn't talk about the CERT teams, which is again another low level version, the community emergency response teams, where they're there as that neighborhood response team to help with whoever's laying on top of that rubble pile, the walking wounded, et cetera, to get them out of the way and to make them force multipliers for that follow-on fire response.
Okay, and that makes sense, yeah. So kind of maybe going back to a little bit of the stuff that we've kind of talked about, you talked specifically about legislation between California and Texas. What is NASAR doing to try to promote good legislation to get some uniformity, or at least a workable system out there?
Right. So for in our advocacy, we go around. We recently, within the past couple of years, met with some representatives from the state of Ohio and worked with the Buckeye Emergency Response team there, and got them to begin moving towards a system of legislated authority for SAR and volunteer protections as well, which we can talk about in a minute. So we travel around. We try to work with the grassroots efforts in different states to make that happen. And in some states, there are search and rescue boards or councils. In Pennsylvania, there's one, but it doesn't represent all the teams in Pennsylvania. There's the Search and Rescue, the Colorado CSRB, the Colorado Search and Rescue Board. It represents all the teams in Colorado. It's a strong board. It's been around. How long has it been around, John? You probably know more than I.
I don't. It would only be a guess, so I don't know. But a long time. Yeah, it's a very organized structure, and it gets into volunteer protection and funding too. But other subjects to come up sometime.
Yeah. So we go out and we try to provide a model, and the model that we give is the California model. And we say to them, look, this is how California has successfully navigated the politics of volunteerism and emergency response. And sometimes that's the problem for states, is the volunteer part. And so they've actually been able to get around that. Matt Sharper, when he designed the system, also kept in mind the fact that many of the leaders that we have to negotiate with and have to accept what we're looking for are elected. And so this has to work for their elected position and not put them in conflict with other elected officials. So we try to explain how that system can work to be collaborative and supportive in a mutual aid system without being in competition with each other. And so that's basically what we do for that one piece of it. And then there are a number of pieces that follow after that, that a legislative SAR authority then enables us to deal with, which are important. And John just mentioned the volunteer protections, which is an important part. And we could talk about that now, or we can talk about that in a couple of minutes after we talk about some of the other things. What's your choice, Doug?
Well, why don't we come back to that, because something that you had mentioned before, and I think what you were just talking about runs into the standard of care, or some kind of a uniformity, and trying to come up with something uniform. You alluded to the like the helicopters in L.A. And I know when I travel out there, I find it interesting. There's more helicopters in Southern California than there is probably in the rest of the country. From a law enforcement and fire service, especially from the fire service perspective, there's a lot more helicopters in Southern California. So how do you come up with a standard of care where you're going from there to possibly some very rural areas with very few, if any, resources?
Yeah, so standard of care, I think, is a little different than a standard of response, which is where we're going. So the standard of care for us would be the training, the education, and the certification, which is the same everywhere, right? So all your law enforcement folks have some standard of care in their state and at their local level. All fire departments have a standard of care wherever they're at. EMS authorities, they all have a standard of care, national level, EMTs, et cetera. Search and rescue is the last place where we deal with people's lives and rescuing them out of situations that aren't necessarily what they're doing, but they're victimized in. And yet there's no standard of care in every state for that. It's crazy. And so I think that having that standard of education certification, being able to do that is the same whether you're in a rural location or whether you're in a highly urbanized environment. The issue will be, how does a team become accredited to be a search and rescue team in that state and work under that standard of care? That's going to be different, because in an urban area you have a lot of people, it's easier to recruit, you probably have a bigger tax base, more money, you follow under the urban area security initiatives or other grant funding that the urban areas don't. And in the urban areas, the rural areas. But in the rural areas, there's kind of a flip side to this. They're rural for a reason. They're agricultural. They don't have a lot of missing folks. You don't see a lot of search and rescue teams up in North Dakota and South Dakota. You just don't. And you don't have a lot of missing people there. But you go to Arizona, or you go to Nevada, where you have lots of visitors that come in because you've got something there that draws them on vacation. It's a destination kind of thing. You're rural, and yet you have a lot of missing people that you have to deal with. And so I think that some sort of special funding or some sort of special care needs to be given to those areas.
And I imagine in the areas too where you have national parks, where you have a huge influx of people that are unfamiliar with wilderness areas and possibly unprepared, that's got to lead to some special challenges as well.
Yeah, I think that from a national park level, you look at it, and the Lincoln Monument, it's a national park. It gets as many visitors in a year as Yosemite does. And Yosemite deals with more car crashes and heart attacks than it does, high-angle climbers. But certainly a high-angle climber rescue in bad weather is fraught with a lot more risk and requires a lot more resources than a simple car crash in the meadow. Mm-hmm. And then Grand Canyon probably has its own special issues and that are required. So I would say that the National Park Service usually steps up in locations where they have to have specialty issues, and they handle that pretty well, and use the locals as a force multiplier.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that the parks are required to have their own search and rescue. And as Chris said, some of them, there's probably, I don't know the numbers, but there's probably 5 or 6 national parks, including Sequoia Kings, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, things like that, where most of the National Park Service search and rescue activity takes place. But kind of talking a little bit about it, and Chris has mentioned some states and others. One of the things that I'd hoped to be able to do in my time at NASAR, and is still a work in process, is get some sort of national statistics type database going, because nobody knows, and as a big search and rescue incident comes around like we have right now, we don't know when this is going to air, but there's a big search going on in Florida right now. It's gotten national attention. Chris has been on the news probably, and nobody knows how many search and rescue incidents there are. And in many, many states, they don't know how many search and rescue incidents there are. So we don't really know sometimes the extent of the problem or how often it's going on or what's missing. And that kind of relates back to something that we've said earlier. Chris and I are both from California, and we've cited California, and I don't want to deter anybody else from that because it's good and it's bad. It's a big state and it's got a lot of people, and that means it has a lot of search and rescue activity, easily more than anybody else. But I can't prove it because we don't really know how many operations are going on in many, many places, including always in this state too. So it's something that NASAR is working on, I know, is to try and really get a handle on how many of these incidents do we have and what's the extent of the problem, and to try and improve it where places where it needs to improve. Because nobody wants to see anything happen to people. It's done by volunteers primarily. We've talked about that before, and they're good people trying to do good things, and we'd like to make it better for them. Make it easier, get them training, whatever. And to do that, we really need the numbers, and that kind of segues back into the volunteer protection, which is something that we kind of mentioned that I would like to see. And it came down to really the history of some of the states, why the organizations became the way they became, or why search and rescue teams evolved a certain way, is getting protection for those volunteers. Because if you've already given time away from your family and your work, and now if something bad happens to you, and unfortunately, search and rescue people have been killed. And unfortunately, more of them have been transportation to and from search operations than probably during search operations. But just the same, there needs to be assistance where necessary for the volunteer searchers, just like there's probably a system for volunteer firefighters. And it's something that we don't want to forget because it is a volunteer activity by and large.
Yeah, John, to piggyback on that, the volunteer protections, and we might as well just get into it right now. A number of issues wrapped around that. So you've got long-term disability, short-term disability, workers' compensation. You've got death benefits in case someone gets killed, and then other things like a legal defense fund. Search and rescue workers can get sued just like any other law enforcement officer or firefighter or first responder. And then of all things, the child labor laws. We have Explorer Scouts out there with teams that are putting their lives at risk as well. From the ages of 14 and on up, we see that. And under typical laws in typical states, those kids, under the age of 18 don't fall under long-term, workers' comp or long-term disability or short-term disability. And they need to, because they're out there still doing the great altruistic work and being stewards in their community to protect those citizens. And so they need that. And all the things I just talked about, California has. They've had it since the late 1960s or so. It's called the Disaster Service Worker Act. And it was put in place to help protect the volunteers in civil defense. And other states are wary of doing that because they're taking on this risk and liability, but they don't know what level the people are trained to and what kind of risks they're going to take, which brings us full circle back to certification, legislative authority. And that's why that's the portal to all this, is that if we can get that legislative authority and the standards of care in place, then now you can tell what's negligence and what's not, and now you can put in place those protections for those well-meaning and well-trained volunteers.
Well, and it seems like politically that would be a no-brainer if they could define what the level of risk is to be able to take care of the comp and the liability protections if they don't have to pay a wage to those people. that should be an absolute no-brainer from a cost-effectiveness standpoint.
And from a political point of view, right? To be the person to put that in place and say, hey, if you're going to go missing, we want a lot of people to go out and look for you. And one of the things that's preventing them from doing that is, their vulnerability to these things. And so we're going to give them the protections, which means that if you, Joe Citizen, go missing as a hunter or riding your ATV or whatever, I'm going to be able to enable a lot more searchers to come and rescue you and take care of you. And by the way, they're also going to be much more highly trained medically for that pre-hospital care system. It's a total win-win.
Yeah. Well, and it would seem, because you had talked a little bit about mutual aid earlier, and it seems to be getting the different entities involved, be it law enforcement, fire, EMS, it would seem to be the most logical way to accomplish, taking care of each one of those. I know there's a lot of very formalized mutual aid systems in the fire world, systems such as MABUS, Mutual Aid Box Alarm System. I know law enforcement has mutual aid packs throughout the country. And so on, but to try to get those groups to work together sometimes is difficult. Some good-natured ribbing back and forth in our area between, the fire guys teasing the law enforcement guys. Hey, you don't want to get your shoes dirty or your hair messed up. What are you doing out in the woods? And of course, law enforcement referring to the firefighters as evidence eradication technicians. So, and some truth to both,
Yeah, there is, but it's back down to training and certification and having the right gear. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I would imagine too is all wrapped into this. The mutual aid part is, formalized mutual aid has got to play an important role to make sure you have an adequate.
Absolutely, because you do have counties that are rich and counties that are poor, and that's typically rural versus urbanized. And you mentioned earlier the helicopters. Yeah, LA County's got one of the largest air forces in North America. And when you look at that and you're a small county like Alpine County in California that only has 1,200 residents, it would be great to assign each of those residents a rescue helicopter. But that's expensive. LA is going to spend a lot of money saving somebody. Right. Whereas Alpine County can send you maybe 10 or 12 people on a good day to help increase. But we know that all it takes is one resource, that one person, that one helicopter to make that rescue. And so every resource is as important as the others.
So how important is it to get somebody, a point person, per se, in each state to make this happen?
We go back to 1969 where the point people in the states started putting this system together, right? And I think that's hugely important. One of the big differences that we see in the states that have formalized active systems is that they have a leader, a visionary, someone that understands the political environment that they're working in, has background in search and rescue or fire or law, and also it understands volunteers to a certain extent, and put that person in charge so they can wrangle all of us together. In California, they have that person, the state SAR coordinator, working through the California Office of Emergency Services. And John and I have worked closely with previous ones and the current one. Oregon has one. State of Washington has one. Nevada is now moving their search and rescue folks out of their DPS, their Department of Public Service, and moving it to their Department of the Military, like the state of Washington has. And that would join their state guard and their National Guard units better into being resources for search and rescue. Absolutely, you got to have somebody that's taken the lead on this, that can work the political organizations, the chiefs of police, the fire chiefs, etc., and get them all together on the same page.
Excellent. So I'm kind of looking at time here, and we're quickly running out. So we didn't even touch on the topic of getting into the weeds on training, and I think that one of the most important topics, because everything we're talking about comes back to that.
Right. So
I think we've demonstrated a need here. We need to have a part 2 of this podcast here.
Well, yeah.
So maybe if we could talk a little bit about what's the future of NASAR? Where do you see what are your kind of your immediate and some of your long-term goals and challenges here?
Yeah, so I think that our long-term goals and challenges continue to be providing quality education and quality certification to the volunteers at a good price point. Almost all of our courses don't go over the price of $70, and that sounds odd. Our for that volunteer that wants to take our 2-day Introduction to Search and Rescue course, it's $70. For that volunteer that wants to take our 40-hour search management course, $70. So you can't even get babysitting for your kid for 40 hours for $70, right? So our price point for our education's got to be there. And also our price point for our textbooks and that sort of thing has to maintain. So we try to artificially depress that pricing through sponsorship. And CMC's been very helpful in that area. As a shout out and props to CMC, they sponsored our latest search management book and paid for almost all of the work that was done on it. And that helps us keep that price really low for a big book to those volunteers. So that's our long-term strategy still. I think that our short-term strategies include still struggling with technology and the use of technology in search and rescue, GIS and mapping, big thing, drones, big issue, spot, local personal safety beacons, big issue. So I think we'll continue to struggle with the technology. And then also COVID has brought us some challenges. So here for the short term, we're still working on online training and how to produce quality training for volunteers that they can take mostly online and then just do the practical skills in a blended learning environment. So I think that those are probably our long and short term. The last thing I would mention is funding. And NASAR's always struggled for funding. And again, that's because we put every dollar back into our products. We have 2 full-time employees, myself and Ellen, and the board of directors is a completely volunteer board. They don't get paid a cent. Every nickel we get goes right back into development of education and certification.
And I got to be, I can't wait to talk more about that because it's, I think that's going to be very interesting to see how you're doing, all you're doing for that low price point. So that's excellent. So John, anything to wrap us up here?
No, I mean, we've got, as always on these podcasts, we seem to open up all those other avenues to discuss and hope that the listeners are getting something out of this. Again, you'll get contact information. And if you have questions for either Chris, myself, or Doug, then make sure that you reach out to us and stay involved. Or if you've got ideas for additional topics or, again, questions for the greater group that you'd like to see discussed on future podcasts.
Yeah. And John and I, we both serve on ASTM. I think one of the other things that we could talk about in the future are how do those standards get put together for education and certification and those standards of care, whether it be ASTM or ISO or NFPA, and how though you out there, the listener, can get involved in that and use your expertise to help us out. And then I think another thing we can eventually talk about are all the different symposiums, ITERs, and where that came from, and some of the other high-level symposiums and conferences that are out there. Iceland puts on a great conference every year, and it's not that far from the New England states. Canada puts on their SAR scene every year, and it's going on just this week, actually.
SAR scene's right now, yeah.
Yep, right now. So there are a lot of good conferences out there for folks to go to.
And I will say, I think that's something that COVID has done is, people, I think, sometimes took for granted some of the in-person networking opportunities. And then when it had to be done via Zoom and other platforms, they kind of realized, hey, this is really important to get people together, to network and to, not only for the formal class, but, sometimes you learn just as much in the hospitality suite and everything afterwards, just talking to your counterparts in different areas of the country or world. The takeaways are unlimited.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'd like to thank our listeners for tuning in to another CMC podcast, and stay tuned for a part 2 of NASAR and what it's doing to advance search and rescue in the U.S. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And all the links that we've discussed will be if you go to the cmcpro.com to the podcast page, you'll see links to each of these things that we've discussed.